Good evening, everyone. Can I get a little bit more light in the crowd so that I can see people's eyes and faces? My teacher always said that we don't tell stories to the audience or at the audience, but with the audience. So I love seeing your faces and your eyes. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Rebecca, and I just want to start with saying thank you to Susmita-ji and Salil-ji and Udaipur and all the people who have powered this festival. I've met some of you and the advisors and all the people in backstage, interested and interesting people that have really made me feel at home here. So thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank my ancestors and my parents who brought me up without a TV, telling me stories, and all of my teachers and masters of different disciplines who somehow nourish the stories that come through me. And also Usha Venkatraman, who got an award yesterday, I can't see her, but who recommended my name. So without her, I wouldn't be here. Thank you so much for this amazing experience that you've helped me to have. So tonight I'd like to tell you a story from Andalusia, an Andalusi story from the south of Spain where I now live. And in Andalusia, I know a few of you have already told me that you've visited, and there's a mixture of cultures. So I'm going to tell you a story from the times of Al-Andalus, when the Arabs, the Moors, ruled over Spain and Portugal, which was from the 8th century, very beginning of the 8th century until the 14th century, so more than 15th century, so more than 700 years. And so to start, maybe, so I invite you to come on this journey with me, and I'll bring you back safely. And to start, maybe if you feel like it, you can close your eyes and I shall take you to this time when the Arabs came to Spain and they brought science, mathematics, medicine, and art and beauty, poetry, calligraphy, music, and they built these incredible palaces and castles with beautiful arches and engravings on the ceilings and on the walls, geometric patterns and inscriptions, passages of the Quran, and poetry, a lot of poetry. And around and within these palaces and castles, they would create gardens and patios, and in these gardens they would plant orchards, lemon trees, orange trees, and they pruned them so that the fruit were always at your fingertip as you walked through the gardens to reflect the abundance of creation. And they would plant fragrant trees like jasmine and the myrtle tree and rosemary, both for their medicinal properties as well as their fragrance and beauty. And they used all of the senses, the architects of these palaces. So we've talked about the taste and the smell. And then they were experts in finding water and conducting it through the palaces. So the water flowed through the palace, just like the blood flows through our veins, through little canals that would link fountains and pools. And in these, so the fountains, they had the sound of the gurgling water, which was refreshing in the hot summers of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus. And they had these perfectly still pools which reflected an arch, a garden, a palace, encouraging a pondering about the nature of reality, what is real, what is not real. And so these were the spaces that they created and which still exist today in Andalusia, where I live, and many of you have visited some of these places. And so our story begins in the Alhambra, which is such a castle in Granada, Garnata in Arabic, where I live. And this Alhambra means the red one in Arabic, alluding to its reddish pinkish color that covers its walls from the outside. And there are many palaces, each one built with a new dynasty. with gardens. And they say that long ago there was a king of the Alhambra, who had no family, but a young son, a newborn son. He had called him Ahmed, but very soon everyone in the palace called him Ahmed al-Kamal, the perfect one, because of his beauty, because of his intelligence and his spirit that he displayed from a very young age. Even the astrologers, they saw this perfection in his charts, the way the planets and the stars aligned perfectly. There was just one grey cloud that hovered above his destiny, they said. The young prince Ahmed al-Kamal was of an amorous temperament. He had this irresistible pull towards love. And this, they said, would bring him and his future reign grave dangers and perils. And the only way to save him was to make sure he would not fall in love until he was of a mature age. Now, the king thought about this problem for a few days and a few nights, and he decided that the only solution was to isolate his young son. And so he had built on a hill behind the Alhambra a beautiful palace with gardens such as the ones I've just described. And this palace still exists. We call it the Generalife. For those who know, it's the white one that is behind the Alhambra. Beautiful palace. And so he locked up his young son in that palace with just a few servants who had the order of never speaking to him, and under the strict care and tutelage of Ibn Bonaben, an old, strict master who had spent his life in Egypt studying in the tombs and the pyramids. "You shall teach him everything you know," said the king, "except for the dangerous science of love. If my son has even a glimpse of anything to do with love, your head will answer for it." And Ibn Bonaben had smiled and said, "Am I a man to teach lessons in such an idle passion?" So the king was relieved, and the little Ahmed al-Kamal grew up in this palace under the care of Ibn Bonaben. Ahmed al-Kamal repressed his yawns and listened patiently to all of the long, boring lessons and discourses of Ibn Bonaben. And this is how he turned from a little toddler to a young boy, to a young teenager, and to a young man, filled with knowledge, all sorts of knowledge, but completely and utterly ignorant of all matters related to love. But just then, at that time, his behavior changed, and he started walking around the gardens dreamily, and he would sit by the fountains and meditate. And he had learned a bit of music during his studies, and now the music absorbed most of his time. And he started writing poetry, and he would recite it to the flowers and his favorite trees in between two nostalgic sighs. لما بدا يتثنى لما بدا يتثنى أمان 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 حبي جمال فتنا أمان 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 أمان. Well, seeing these sweet tendencies of the young prince, Ibn Bonaben was alarmed, and so he proposed an even more advanced course in algebra. And this time, the young prince laughed, and he rebelled, and he said, "No, I need something that speaks more to my heart." Ibn Bonaben felt his head wobbling on his shoulders. The young prince had discovered he possessed a heart. And so, to save the young prince and his own head, he locked the prince in the highest tower of the Generalife, the palace, with beautiful views, but far from the seductions of the gardens. But then he thought how to make the young prince accept this violence, how to alleviate the boredom that he was now going to feel. By chance, there was still one science that he hadn't taught the young prince, a science that he hadn't thought was very important, a science that he had learnt from a Jewish rabbi in Egypt, a science that had been transmitted from generation to generation since the king Solomon the Wise, who himself had learnt it from the Queen of Sheba, the language of birds. And as soon as he mentioned it to the young prince, Ahmed's eyes lit up. He accepted, he applied himself so well that very soon he was better versed in the new language than his own master. But then he had to practice. And he looked out of his window, and he had seen a hawk a few times out of one of the windows of the tower. And he called the hawk. And the hawk told Ahmed he was a pirate of the airs. And he told Ahmed about his exploits and his bravery. And then Ahmed met an owl who lived in one of the towers of the Generalife. And the owl told Ahmed that he was a philosopher, amateur archaeologist, and with some knowledge in magic. But sometimes his long discourses were even more boring than those of Ibn Bonabin for Ahmed. And then he met a bat. But the bat spent his days, or more likely his nights, criticizing everything and everybody. And then he met a swallow. And the swallow was really sweet and joyful, but she was always flying here and there and everywhere, and she never really had time for long conversations. And so that was it, because the windows of Ahmed's room at the top of the tower were just far too high for the little birds from the gardens to reach them. So the long months of winter passed, with Ahmed's boredom only now and again interrupted by his conversations with his feathered friends. But then spring arrived, with its flowers blooming and its perfumed breezes that did reach the windows of Ahmed, and the time for birds to pair and to make their nests. And there was at that moment a burst of concerts and melodies sung by the little birds in the gardens, and it went something like this. And thank you to the birds. It was beautiful. And Ahmed, he clapped as well, and he listened. And in those songs, there was one invariable theme, which was sung in every voice and in every tone. Habibi, 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 hub, 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 love, love, love. Li habibi ursil salam. Li habibi ursil salam. Li habibi ursil salam. Kula waqtin asa yajud, asa yajud. كل وقت عسى يجود عسى يجود. And Ahmed, he listened and he wondered, but what is this love they speak of which the world seems full and of which I know nothing? Well, he decided to ask his friends. So first he called the hawk, and the hawk said, I'm a warrior. I don't know what this thing they call love is, and I don't really care, to be honest. So he called the owl, and the owl said, I remind you, I am a philosopher way above these earthly matters. I don't know what love is. So he asked the bat, And the bat said, I'm a misanthrope. I really don't care what this thing they call love is. And then he called the swallow, and she said, well, it does seem really nice, but, I'm a citizen of the world, and I don't really have time for this thing they call love. So he had one more person he could ask, Eben Bunabin. So the next time the master visited him, he said, Master, I thought you had taught me everything you knew. What is this thing they call love? Eben Bunabin stood like struck by lightning, and then he said, But young prince, where did you hear that word? And Ahmed called him to the window, and they listened. And Ibn Bunabin said, Allahu Akbar, how am I going to hide this secret if the whole of creation is conspiring to reveal it? And then he turned to Ahmed and he said, Prince, close your ears to this dangerous knowledge, this dangerous science. Impede it from reaching your intelligence. You must know that love is the cause of half of the ills of which suffer the mortals. Joyless days and sleepless nights is what love brings. And he left, leaving Ahmed more perplexed than ever. He carried on listening. In those songs, he could hear no accents of pain, only sweetness and joy and peace. Salam, salam, salam. Well, a few days later, he was sitting and pondering and meditating on this mystery that had entered his life, when suddenly he heard a sound of fluttering wings, and in came a white dove, which was being pursued by his friend the hawk. And the dove fell to the ground, gasping, and the hawk, seeing that he had missed his prey, carried on his flight towards the mountains. Ahmed picked up the dove and smoothed its feathers and calmed it. And when it was better, he locked the dove in a golden cage that he had there in his room. For all the knowledge that he had, he still missed the wisdom. And that's why he didn't understand why the dove was lying at the back of the cage, sighing, refusing all food and care. And so after a few days, Ahmed asked the dove, but beautiful dove, do you not have everything that your heart can desire here? And the dove said, of course not. You've deprived me of my freedom. You've separated me from my love in this. Love, said Ahmed. You know what love is? And the dove said, yes. I beg of you, beautiful dove, tell me, what is this thing they call love? And so the dove said, love, young prince, is the principal secret of life. Love, young prince, is the grand mystery of nature. Love, young prince, is to fly to a secret sky and cause 1,000 veils to fall at all times. But then, seeing Ahmed's confused face, the dove said, well, let's start by the basics. You know, prince, love, a charm that attracts two beings, uniting them with sweet ties of sympathies, and when they're together, they're happy and content and joyful, and when they're separated, they're filled with sweet torments. You know, love. Young prince, have you spent your whole youth without knowing nothing of love? Has no being captured your heart? And Ahmed, listening to the dove, said, I think I'm beginning to understand. I have felt that nostalgia, that melancholy, that separation, but without knowing its cause. He said, please tell me more. And the dove continued talking about how love is the torment of one and the joy of two who become one. Aye, the mystery of love. We are born of love. Love is our mother, said the dove. And after further conversation, Ahmed had been initiated in the science of love, and he understood a bit more about the world and about his own being. And so he freed the dove. He placed her on the windowsill of one of the windows, and he said, go, beautiful dove, May Allah prevent me from disturbing those who can live their love. Go and find your love, live your love, be free. I here in my tower, I will never meet an object of love such as you describe. And seeing his saddened face, the dove said, young prince, you remind me of someone. During my long journeys far and wide, once I saw a palace with a beautiful garden surrounding it, crossed by a river. And as I went down to refresh and to drink, I met a young princess, and just like you, she spoke the language of birds. And that day, she was really sad because she had just found out that the reason why she had grown up isolated, far from everyone in that garden and that palace, was because they wanted to keep her away from love until her father chose her husband. Ahmed couldn't believe it. He asked 1,000 questions about the princess, and listening to the description of the dove, about this being that was so far that he knew nothing of, but with whom he had so much in common. She even wrote poetry, while his heart was set ablaze, and all the latent beauty of his nature found an object in which to express itself. He fell passionately in love with the unknown princess, and without waiting another second, he sat and he wrote a letter written in the most ardent and passionate terms and verses, the best verses he tried to write in the moment, but also complaining about his situation, which impeded him from going to find her and throwing himself at her feet and asking her hand in marriage. When will I be able to express what ails me? Oh, my torment, my torture, and my delight. When will my lips have the pleasure of expressing it instead of my feather? And then he perfumed it and he gave it to the dove. And he said, go, beautiful dove, cross mountains, fly above mountains, rivers, valleys, and do not rest until you've delivered this letter to the mistress of my heart. And so the dove took its flight. And Ahmed followed it with his eyes until it disappeared behind a mountain. Well, to Ahmed, it seemed like an eternity, the waiting for the return of the dove, even though it was only really a few days. But one day, as he was sitting there writing poetry, feeling all the emotions, the illusion, the despair, and the sweet sorrows that the dove had talked about, suddenly he saw the dove fly in through one of the windows, fall to his feet, and die. An archer had crossed its chest with his arrow, and the faithful messenger had used the last moments of her life to deliver the message. He picked the lifeless body up, and smoothing the feathers, he found a letter from the princess. Mando mi saludo, que los cálices de las flores abre, que hace zurrear a las palomas en las ramas, a un amigo distante, que vive en mis entrañas, aunque mis ojos de verlo están privados. I send a greeting that opens the calyxes of flowers, that makes the doves coo in the branches, to a distant friend who dwells in my heart, even though my eyes are deprived of seeing him. And followed the most subtle and beautiful verses that Ahmed had ever read. She said that her love for him was like the light that ignites life. She said that she felt one with him without even knowing him. She talked of union and expansion, and she said that the sweet separation that had taken hold of her heart would not allow her to stay still. She said that the state of the lover was to be movement, like the bird. And that is why, my dear, we cannot wait until they free us, she wrote. We must. But then the letter stopped abruptly, as if the princess had been interrupted by someone. There was just one more sentence, written obviously with haste. Our friend the dove will tell you about my plan. Ahmed looked at the letter, at the dove, There wasn't a name, there wasn't a place, nothing. And how am I going to find out? Locked up in this golden cage, he wondered. Ahmed fell to the ground and wept inconsolably. But then, amongst his tears, he saw the words, "The state of the lover is to be movement like the bird." That's what she had written. He got up and he thought, that's it. I'm going to flee this tower, and pilgrim of love, I shall travel the world in search of the beautiful unknown princess. Well, love doesn't wait. And so he decided to escape that same night. You know, after so many years of him having seemed to be resigned to his captivity, the guard had relaxed quite a bit, especially at night time. But then Ahmed wondered who was going to guide him in the dark. And in general, he knew nothing of the country of Al-Andalus. He knew nothing of the world. The owl who always told him about his long journeys when he'd go and explore towers as an archaeologist and visit his numerous family members. The owl. He called the owl. He told him about his tender passion. He told him about his plan to escape, and the owl started by reminding him that he was a philosopher well above these earthly matters. But then Ahmed reminded the owl that one day, Ahmed would be king, and he offered the owl a position of dignity and honor. And well, he was a philosopher, the owl, and he was above these things, but he wasn't above ambition. And so he accepted to be the guide and advisor of Ahmed during his pilgrimage. So that very same night, Ahmed lowered himself from the tower with his long scarf. He crossed the gardens, he climbed the walls, and he escaped before dawn. But where do we go? He asked the owl. Well, the owl had already thought about it. Sevilla, he said. In Sevilla, the owl knew of a raven who had come decades ago with his master, a magician. The raven himself, if he's still alive, I think he is, said the owl. The master died long ago, but the raven, well versed in magic, as all ravens are, I don't know if you know that, but also this one was a fortune teller. He shall be able to help us. Let's go. And so they started the journey towards Sevilla. And they only traveled at night to accommodate the owl. And during the day, they would rest in caves and towers. And I'll cut this next part short because they did get to Sevilla and they did find the raven, a mysterious old bird, bald with ragged feathers, who they found studying a parchment filled with mysterious symbols. But the raven, after studying the letter of the princess for just a short moment, shook his head and said he wouldn't be able to help them without a date of birth, a place of birth, a name. Fortune-telling could do nothing. But then he recommended they continue and go to Cordoba. And in Cordoba, they would find a great and old, experienced traveler who had visited all countries and all of the courts, and who was a favorite of the queens and princesses. He'll be able to help you, said the raven. So the owl and Ahmed continued their journey to Cordoba. And they crossed the beautiful valley of the Guadalquivir with its hanging gardens and lemon trees and orange trees. And they got to the walls of the city of Cordoba. And the owl, not wanting to enter in the hustle and bustle of a city, found himself a dark hole in the wall of the city, and Ahmed entered. And following the instructions of the raven, he found the Grand Mosque, which I'm sure some of you have visited. He entered into the main courtyard, and there, as the raven had said, stood the high palm tree, a palm tree that had been planted by Abdurrahman the Great, one of the first kings, when he was missing his homeland of Syria so much. And beneath the tree, there was a crowd, and they were listening to an individual who seemed to be speaking with great volubility. And so Ahmed thought this will be the journey, the traveler, he's here. And so he made his way to the front of the crowd, but then he realized that these people were listening to a bird with a colorful coat, a crest, a hooked beak, a parrot. And he asked somebody, this is the great traveler that everybody comes to listen to? And the man said, yes, he's the descendant of the great parrot of Persia. Who's renowned for his storytelling talents. And this one, he's traveled everywhere. And he knows every single poet and their poetry off by heart. Shh, listen. So Ahmed listened. And after the conference, he asked for a private audience with the parrot. And he said to the parrot, you who've visited all of the courts, he showed him the letter. He said, do you not know of a princess that they've isolated so she would not know love? And she speaks the language of birds. And the parrot thought about it, and he said, well, the language of birds I wouldn't know because I speak the language of humans, but hang on, it does sound familiar. Ah, Aldegunda, the princess Aldegunda. Yes, it's the princess Aldegunda. Aldegunda. Ahmed repeated it. It seemed to him like the sweetest name in the world. And he said, but where do I meet her? And the parrot said, no, you won't be able to meet her. She's the only child of the Christian king of Toledo, because by then Al-Andalus had already gone to the south and had been pushed back to the south of Spain. So in the north, Toledo, the Christians were there. And he said, no, she's the only daughter of the Christian king of Toledo. And as you say, she's been isolated. They don't let anyone near her, and she's very well guarded. They brought me to her presence to distract her. She's very interesting, that princess. We had good conversations, and she writes beautiful poetry, may I say. Ahmed begged the parrot to accompany him. He said, you know her. You'll be able to present me. You'll bring me luck somehow. And the parrot, had never refused the chance to go on a journey or to be part of a love story, even though he thought it was doomed from the beginning. Or maybe for something that he saw in Ahmed's eyes, that unique combination of innocence and fire and purity. And so he accepted. So they left the town by the same big door in the wall through which Ahmed had entered. They found the owl, and Ahmed introduced them as wise colleagues. And off they went, this time in the direction of Toledo, that strange, unusual trio of the pilgrim of love, the parrot, and the owl. Well, the journey was so slow, far too slow for the impatient heart of Ahmed. Because you see, the parrot was used to the luxurious life of palaces, and so he would refuse to get up before noon. And then the owl, who didn't want to travel during the day in the first place, demanded to have long siestas. And so they went slow and slow. And on top of that, Ahmed, thinking they were both birds of learning, thought they would get on well. He had never been further from the truth. They never stopped bickering. The parrot, he only wanted to tell gossip about the courts that he had visited, recite poetry, sing songs. All this was far beneath the intelligence of the owl, who only wanted to speak about philosophy and metaphysics. In turn, the parrot would laugh at the owl, and the owl would grumble and fly away, suddenly having to absolutely discover or explore such and such a tower, because he was an archaeologist after all. And sometimes they had to wait for hours until the owl would deign come back and travel with them again. And in those times, they would sit, and the owl would teach Ahmed poetry and tell him stories about the courts that he had visited. And slowly, they continued their way, and they crossed the harsh passes of the Sierra Morena, the mountain range, the sunburnt plains of Castilla de la Mancha. They got to the banks of the Rio Tajo, the river, and one day from the top of a hill, they saw a fortified city. The renowned and legendary city of Toledo. said the owl, where so many of my ancestors have meditated in its domes and towers. Bah, who cares about your ancestors and towers, said the parrot. Let's focus. And with his colourful wing, he pointed at something, a palace surrounded by a garden. Ahmed's heart skipped a beat. The garden was crossed by a river. It was identical to the one described by the dove as the residence of the princess. She'll be there right now, thinking about me, writing poetry. We're here. But then looking closely, his heart sank. The garden was surrounded by high walls, and there were armed guards patrolling around these walls. And so Ahmed sent his 2 friends to go and reconnoiter, and he said, find out whatever you can and tell the princess I'm here, tell her. The 2 birds flew towards the city of Toledo, towards the royal palace, and Ahmed sat. And he waited. His heart was throbbing. And to calm himself down, he recited some of the poetry that he had learnt from the parrot along the way. There was one poem especially that had really captivated his heart. It was by the great Ibn Arabi, an Andalusi poet. And it went like this. أدين بديني الحب أنا تواجهت ركائبه فالحب ديني وإيماني. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for idols, sacred ground, the Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tables for the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. Adinu bidini al-hub, my religion is love, wherever its caravan may lead me. Al-hub dini wa imani, for love is my belief, my creed. Ahmed opened his eyes, and there he saw the parrot flying back. It was almost dusk. Why had it taken so long? The parrot had no good news. The parrot hadn't been able to talk or even see the princess who was no longer in the gardens. Why not? Asked Ahmed. Well, apparently she escaped. What? She escaped? Where is she? Outside of Toledo. Let's go. Wait, said the parrot. And the parrot told Ahmed what he had learned asking people in the city and in the palace. It seemed like the princess had escaped a few weeks ago. But just as she was leaving the city through one of the doors in the city walls, one of the guards had recognized her despite her disguise, had dragged her back to the palace, and there something unheard of had happened. The young princess had rebelled. She had told her father that she was already in love with a prince, poet, Muslim. And the father, the king of Toledo, had said, never, you'll marry who I tell you, and definitely not a poet and not a Muslim. And he locked her up in the highest tower of the royal palace. And now, they said, she was devoured by a melancholy that was eating her up. She was refusing all food and care from the doctors of the court. She was wasting away. They said she would die if nothing was done. And Ahmed's tender heart remembered Ibn Bonabin, and he said, sorrow, pain is what love brings. Maybe he was right. Now my beloved is lovesick because of me. And then the parrot said, there is something else. The king said that whoever may cure the princess will get a reward, the richest jewel from the royal treasure. Ahmed didn't know what to do with that information. And so the parrot and Ahmed, they spent the whole night making and unmaking plans, how to get a message to the princess, how to enter the palace, how to ask the king for her hand in marriage, how to help her escape. But none of these plans seemed safe enough, nor for Aldegunda or for Ahmed. And so they continued to think. And at dawn, they saw the owl flying back. And the owl brought no news different from that of the parrot. He had spent the night at a conference of antiquarian and archaeologist owls in one of the towers of the palace. But then, when the owl heard about the reward from the royal treasure, the owl started jumping around Ahmed, saying, "This is your chance, young prince, this is your chance." "What do you mean?" asked Ahmed. He had never seen the owl so excited. And he said, "Just this night in the conference, we were discussing objects from the royal treasure, and specifically an object, a little chest of sandalwood, covered in mysterious symbols engraved that none of the savant owls had been able to decipher. But just this night, a savant ancient owl who had just arrived from Egypt had come to the conclusion that this sandalwood chest was the one thought to be lost to humanity that had belonged to Solomon the Wise." And Ahmed also started getting excited. The parent didn't understand anything. And Ahmed said, "Yes, Ibn Bunabin told me about this marvelous object and its magical properties, probably unknown to the Christians of Toledo. Yes, it was brought by the Jews at the fall of Jerusalem to Toledo." He said, "Yes, it can be my salvation." And so the parrot asked what was happening. They told him there was no time. So the parrot was as confused as you all are. But Ahmed, he changed himself and he wore these simple clothes from looking like an Arab from the desert. He painted his face so no one would be able to recognize the prince, the enemy prince with whom the princess had fallen in love. And just with a simple flute, he approached the palace. He got to the palace doors and he presented himself as an aspirant to get the reward from the royal treasure for curing the princess. And the guards, they laughed at him and they said, "How can a simple vagrant from the desert succeed where the most eminent doctors have failed?" But the king, hearing the tumult and not wanting to lose any opportunity to save his daughter, gave the order for them to bring the Arab in his presence. And Ahmed introduced himself as a Bedouin, whom in the solitudes of the desert had learned some cures to cure some strange illnesses caused by evil spirits that tormented the shepherds and their goats and their camels. And he said, "As our remedy, we use music. We sing and play tunes which are transmitted from generation to generation. If your daughter is under such a spell, I know I can deliver her from its sway." And the king, well, he knew that the Arabs, they possessed these incredible secrets, and encouraged by Ahmed's confidence, he brought him to the tower where Aldegunda's room was at the top. And he brought him to a terrace on which one of the windows of Aldegunda's room gave. And so Ahmed sat, he took his flute, and he played a very simple tune. In the room where Aldegunda was, lying in bed surrounded by the doctors, there was no response, no reaction. And the doctors, they looked at each other. But then Ahmed started reciting the poetry that he had written to the princess in his letter to her. And almost immediately, Aldegunda turned her head towards the window in disbelief. And now Ahmed was reciting the poetry that she had written to him in her letter, those beautiful, subtle verses that only she and he knew. And now Aldegunda, she sat up in bed with tears streaming down her cheeks. And so she said, "Ahmed, my beloved, is that you?" But so as not to be understood, she formulated her question in the language of birds. And from the terrace, Ahmed answered also in the language of birds. Yes, Aldegunda, I'm here, pilgrim of love, I have come to find you. And so ensued a conversation between Aldegunda sitting up in her bed and Ahmed on the terrace, a conversation that only the little birds who were flying around and stopped chirping were able to listen to and understand. In the bedroom, the doctors were looking at each other, astonished. And the king, well, he didn't care. All he saw was that the roses had returned to his daughter's cheeks. And so when she asked for the Arab to be brought into her room, he didn't resist. And Ahmed was taken into the room. And the lovers were very discreet. They only exchanged glances that spoke volumes. But the king, he saw nothing, and he was talking about the power of music and how Ahmed should be the first doctor of the court and how he would only use music as his remedy. But then he said, your reward. And so Ahmed said that as an Arab from the desert, he didn't need jewels or gold. He said, but I do understand that amongst the objects of the royal treasure, there's a sandalwood chest, and he described it. And the doctors, they laughed at this novice who was asking for such little reward for his job, especially when they saw this simple chest. Ahmed opened the chest, and out of it he took a green silk carpet, a beautiful silk carpet covered in engravings, and he laid it out on the floor and he sat on it. And he said, this carpet, Your Majesty, covered the throne of Solomon the wise. It's only just and fair that it be under royalty and beauty right now. And so he held out his hand to the princess who came and sat next to him on the carpet. And they both sat there and they looked at the king. It was time. And Ahmed said, Your Majesty, my name is Ahmed, future King of Granada. Your daughter and I have been in love for a long time, and I have come to ask for her hand in marriage. And Aldegunda said, Father, I love this pilgrim of love, and I shall marry no one else. The king was petrified for an instant, and then he said, Guards, cut off this traitor's head. But he had only just finished his sentence that the carpet carrying Aldegunda and Ahmed started to rise into the air. And it went and it hovered outside on the terrace for a while before continuing its flight towards the hills. The guards, the doctors, the king, they all stared at it until it disappeared into the bright blue infinite sky. And on the carpet, well, Ahmed and Aldegunda, they were exchanging poetry. We're not exactly sure who recited which because, at the end of the day, lovers do not finally meet somewhere. They're within each other all the time. أحبك حبيني حب الهوى وحبا لي أناك أحلم لذاك. I love thee with two loves, one human love and one love worthy of thee. The first is to remember you at all times, to the exclusion of all others. But in the love worthy of thee, the veil is lifted, that I may see thee whole in all. Well, back at the palace, the king, he had gathered a whole army and they were marching on Granada in pursuit of the fugitives. And when they arrived in Granada, he left the army on the outskirts, La Vega, and he presented himself at the palace with threats in his eyes and on his tongue to recuperate his daughter. But when he was taken in to the throne room and he saw Ahmed, king, because in the meantime his father had died, and Aldegunda, his daughter, queen, shining with joy and happiness. And she had kept her Christian religion, which was always a point of honor in those times between the kingdoms. Well, the threats dissolved. And instead of bloody battles, there was a series of celebrations until the monarch, satisfied, returned with his army to Toledo. Well, Aldegunda and Ahmed, they reigned from the Alhambra on Granada with a lot of wisdom, with, as Prime Minister, the owl, and as Master of Ceremonies, the parrot. And the love that they had for each other, it was transcendental. It didn't stay locked into the palace. It expanded. And it was a long period of peace and joy within Granada kingdom, but also with the neighboring kingdoms. And so that love and that peace that the dove, let's not forget the dove was talking about, and that is within the cave of each one of our hearts. Well, I wish we all can see it and feel it and touch it and allow it to spread its wings like the birds from this tale. Thank you so much. Thank you. So this story is a traditional story that was collected by Washington Irving in one of his books, The Tales of the Alhambra. But this is very much my version. I've cut chunks out and I've changed quite a few things based on my research and my inner experience. And then there's a lot of poetry by Andalusian poets. And the muwashaha, the snippets of the songs, are poems that were written during Al-Andalus in Spain. But then when the Arabs were expelled to North Africa, they put the melodies on these poems. And then a few poets which I think you've probably recognized, like Rumi and Rabia. So thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.